we know centralized companies kind of suck, and there is a lot of inefficiencies in large bureaucracies, whether that's governments or corporations, etc., that tend to crowd out innovation, and they struggle to adapt. And so we see the mortality rate of large organizations just increasing as they struggle to keep up with the pace of innovation and technological development. Now, then that is kind of like the issue with centralized collaboration. And then we go into this fantasy of decentralization, which hasn't been very well defined in many ways. It's more like the opposite of centralization. And we go into this romanticized dream that if we could all just collaborate, things would magically happen, and that would be beautiful. But as we know, through the last 7, 8, even 10 years of trying to create different DAOs and emergent networks, and a lot of the experimentation that's happened in Web3, plus a lot of the experimentation that's happened outside of Web3, we know that lack of a structure tends to lead to even more dysfunctional networks than centralized collaboration. So we have, unfortunately, now a lot of DAOs going back to more centralized, more traditional top-down hierarchical forms of organization, given the frustrations with decentralization, where there is a lack of accountability. There can be some sort of power vacuums where, in theory, anyone can go and do something, but they're not necessarily incentivized to do something. And the moment they want to be incentivized, we need to unlock social consensus. We need to unlock resources, like scarce resources that are managed by the collective, etc. And anyway, we end up kind of stuck a little bit with a lot of the unfortunate challenges that DAOs are facing today. So that to say that what I'm going to suggest is not a form of decentralized collaboration, even though sometimes in social media and so on, I would use the word lightly to signal something different than the status quo. But really what I'm talking about here is a form of polycentric collaboration. And I'm going to go on to lay down a little bit more of the thesis and the mechanisms for how I think a better form of organization can happen and exist that is not decentralized, but is also not quite centralized. Instead of that is what we would call polycentric, or multiple centers, multiple small teams working together. So the issue with a lot of this decentralized collaboration or even centralized collaboration is that building startups is really, really hard. Right now, we see that 75% of hackathon winners abandon their projects because there is not enough viability, the team is not quite there, the motivation, the incentives don't align, and even though they won a hackathon, they abandon it. Even generally said that 9 out of 10 startups that go through an accelerator program, they still fail and end up returning 0 to investors. Then 94% or more even of grantee projects in Web3 ecosystems that receive some funding from the ecosystem, after that funding runs out, nothing. That's the end of the road. We don't see any value coming out of that. So it's a system that has tremendous amount of wastage, or like the way we're actually trying to go and develop products and services and make those financially viable and sustainable and deliver value to people and so on, is a system where failure is the norm a lot more than success. So a tremendously dysfunctional system, unfortunately. And so where I see that we can do a lot of improvements is actually on reducing this failure rate. Now, however, the usual approach to thinking about these is that it really relies on this mythical founder that is capable to do all kinds of things, that can go and fundraise and do sales and do marketing and be founder-led brand, and at the same time be a technical expert, and at the same time attract the best talent, and so on and so on and so on. So we're kind of over-relying on an extremely narrow and small pool of talent and hoping that they are going to carry the burden of the whole innovation ecosystem. And sometimes that works, but naturally is more the exception than the norm, that we find these sort of incredible individuals that against all odds can succeed. And from the research, like, it becomes very obvious that really the unit of work is a team. and specifically cross-disciplinary teams that succeed very well. There is a lot of hype right now talking about solo founders and augmenting founders with the AI. But there is, for example, BCG did some really fascinating research where they combine the outcomes of individuals working with AI, teams, and teams working with AI. And by far the best outcomes are those of teams working with AI. Now, individuals working with AI, they definitely outperform individuals by a lot. They can even in some situations outperform teams. But when we talk about teams augmented with AI, they outperform once again. So even as we have these AI tools that can give us feedback, that can augment the individual quite a bit, I have yet to see any credible evidence or even any credible theory of why these tools would become better than collaboration between small groups of people. Now, that is assuming that the team structure is functional. And that's going to be one of the main challenges, or continues to be one of the main challenges, is how to create effective teams and how to support these teams well. But still to date, and given all the data I have seen, the fundamental unit of work and the fundamental unit of innovation continues to be the team, and not the individual, and not a very large ecosystem. However, that's where I think we can go a lot further, is when we start to think about how we support these teams, how we assemble these teams, and how these teams collaborate with one another. Because what we have seen is that largely when we have these large Web3 ecosystems that are trying to support innovation, the main mechanism that has been used so far is deploying capital. So they will set up a VC fund that can invest. They will set up a grant program that can give free money to entrepreneurs and builders. And those outcomes are just not very good. Like, we're still following the previous scenario where the large majority fails. But when we look in more detail at the successful stories of startups, what we can see is that is not even just the team, is the village. And all the entourage that is around the team that supports it, that incubates it, to really take an idea to fruition. Because a small team will only have a limited amount of expertise. There is a lot of things that they don't know. It's hard for small teams to self-regulate past a certain point. So having that broader entourage that can offer different forms of capital, that can help regulate the team, that can essentially incubate the whole venture, leads to significantly more successful outcomes. And that's why I see that ecosystems that gather a lot of support systems, like, for example, Silicon Valley, become hotspot of innovation. It's all the broader resources that can more efficiently be plugged in and deployed when there is a good idea, when there is something that is starting to take hold, to accelerate, give it shape, support it, and overall incubate. So from this kind of general worldview, where we've been going is that if we really want to upgrade entrepreneurial ecosystems, we can do that taking the teams as the fundamental unit of work, but then creating network of teams that can work together. Especially if we go further and work towards modular solutions that can integrate with each other like Lego building blocks. And so in this sense, we don't end up with a whole bunch of disparate startups, but we actually end up with startups that are doing deep collaboration with each other, especially in terms of offering more complex solutions to end customers, as well as getting better access to customers. This becomes particularly important in industry, if we're moving to B2B sort of industries, where the sales cycles are slow and building trust takes a lot more time. In these kind of cases, where we can have teams support each other, like happens in large corporations, where, for example, you sell one product and then immediately you have that account, you start selling them the next product and the next product and the next product to the same account. And that's how we have companies like SAP making hundreds of millions of dollars, is because they have these portfolio of projects that are being sold to the same customers. So they are essentially leveraging these relations to generate more value out of them. So the question is there some way that we can come and marry some of these economic efficiencies of corporations, namely economies of scale, and at the same time combine them with the speed and entrepreneurialism that we see in smaller teams? And that's the foundational concept of Swarms, is trying to leverage scale without sacrificing speed to bureaucracy, without sacrificing the ability to try more ideas quickly and then accelerate and scale up those that work. So the point is having this network of entrepreneurial teams that build solutions that then collaborate with each other, and where they're also incentive aligned to integrate and collaborate. Because we need, of course, an economic financial model that enables these to take hold. Otherwise, we're ending up, unfortunately, in the kumbaya of some of the early DAO experiments or NFT communities, where we're like, yeah, if everyone holds the NFT, we're naturally going to start developing business models. And in practice, that doesn't happen a lot because of free rider problems. Like, you actually need to have the individuals incentivized efficiently at an individual level to contribute to the collective, while at the same time having enough independence and agency to work quickly. So that's kind of like the problem that we're trying to solve with Swarms, is trying to figure out how to enable that combination of scale and speed, of having access to bigger resources, but still be able to innovate. And as we have advanced with these, we're starting now to get closer to what I would even call a formula for how Swarms can operate. And so the essence of that formula are these 5 key components. Having a niche focus, the leveraging venture studios as an entrepreneurial model, the units being interdependent, that is not codependent nor fully independent, but interdependent, so they can support and collaborate each other efficiently, but they're not merged into a single bureaucracy that would slow them down. Having flexible investment contracts that can cover for multiple scenarios and essentially kind of structure these relationships to avoid conflicts and as well to align incentives. And finally, this idea of sweat equity, where different contributors can invest in the network, and the more they can invest, the more the network can leverage a broader pool of resources that they wouldn't necessarily be able to access otherwise. And I'll go into more detail into every one of these now. So the point of the niche focus is, on one side, that if we're doing this in Web3, Web3 is no longer a single industry. There was a time where it was possible for me to more or less know everything that was happening in DeFi, and at the same time know everything that was happening in DAOs, more or less. And now it's been many years that it's no longer possible. If you're into the collaboration side of things, probably you have a limited understanding of what's happening in gaming, or what's happening in DePIN or DeSci, or all the other industries that are emerging and need to develop here. And this is also mirroring trends that we see outside of Web3, where we have a lot of niche specialized funds, especially for emerging managers. So this is a lot of VC funds that are raising $5 to $10 million sort of range, maybe up to 20 million, but they're benefiting because they have deep expertise in a specific community, in a specific industry, and so they can assess where to deploy capital more efficiently, and they have the network, the deep network of relationships, so they get access to deals faster than the A16 sets of this world. And as the industry matures, the more and more it becomes important to really understand the nuances of what's happening there, especially if we're going to support teams effectively. Because what we have with accelerators that became a very, very common model over the last 20 years and just started multiplying the number of accelerators, and so many even Web3 ecosystems have launched their own accelerators, and so many industries have their accelerators, but is that because these accelerators end up being somewhat generalist, and that happens with us when I joined Techstars with a startup I was doing some time ago, and what we were finding is that the level of support they can provide, despite being Techstars, which is basically the #2 best accelerator in the world, so despite being Techstars, the level of support they could offer was still very limited. And because they didn't really understood the nuances of our problem, they didn't have networks with the specific customers we're trying to sell to. They didn't have access to the sort of talent that was interested in working for a company in or a specific sector. So they could maybe amplify, they could retweet, they could give us some good generalist advice, but their understanding of the topic at hand was still very limited. And so what we're seeing is that it becomes increasingly effective to actually pick a narrower market where, especially we want the different teams to collaborate, where these different teams can actually have more overlap in terms of access to customers, access to talent, access to relevant investors or capital networks, et cetera, et cetera. So then coming to the second component, and this really goes on to compound with the first thing, and we started going through this path first through first principles. Like it wasn't until much later going down the path that we realized that what we were doing, what for us, we just starting to arrive, the conclusions we started to arrive and suddenly it made sense, is that there was already a name for it. And that was venture studios. And suddenly we're like, oh, turns out we're part of this new emerging trend. We didn't know there was a category name for it. We didn't know it was a thing. But is an extraordinarily interesting form of approaching entrepreneurship, where some of the data that we're seeing is that venture studio startups tend to have double the internal rate of return of traditional startups. That means essentially, if you're going to put in $1 million into traditional startups or $1 million into venture studios, you will do twice as good into venture studios, and you'll do it as well twice as fast. Like venture studio startups mature significantly faster than other startups out there. Equally, we see that the number of venture studios is growing really, really fast. We're kind of doubling almost every year. Probably by now, we're talking multiple thousands venture studios that exist globally, each with different focuses. And we have now a very good track record of venture studios that have created some mythical companies like Beyond Meat, Lyft, Medium, Giphy, Bitly, Moderna. The COVID vaccine, for example, is coming out of one specific venture studio that has over 50 exits. Now think about that in that way. We have a single organization that has over 50 exits in what they're doing. So the way this happens, or like what I mean by these venture studios, this trend is that they are using more systematic and repeatable processes to build startups. So it aligns very much with this idea of the network of teams, et cetera, that I was talking about before, where instead of building startups alone in the wild, you already have a bunch of systems and processes that you know work. And what you're trying to do is kind of put startups through this conveyor belt, so the team of every startup can focus on what's unique about their business instead of endlessly debating what's the best way to construct a roadmap or what's the best way to do some LinkedIn sales outreach or whatever other small processes that there is. They can just leverage existing processes. And then if they try the version suggested by the venture studio and they don't like it, they can start to iterate, and then those iterations become learning for the overall studio. But ultimately, we're relying on having the teams a lot more focused on what's unique to them, as opposed to dealing with generalist problems that the studio can simply pass on that knowledge from one startup to the next and one startup to the next. And the venture studios do that through having dedicated staff that works in the startups. So this is not an accelerator where you get a mentor that gives you a little bit of advice once per week, but you're actually talking about having dedicated staff that is working in your team as a fractional co-founder, supplementing a lot of activities and going very, very much into the details of the business, and that way helping to cross-pollinate between all the different teams and bring expertise, and as well learn from every startup so you can reinvest that knowledge into the next startup and into the next and into the next. And that's how organizations like Flagship Pioneering managed to get to 50 exits, is because after you've been doing this for a long time, there is very little left to chance. There is actually a tremendous amount of expertise that you're reinvesting and bringing in every time into every new venture. So it takes some time to accumulate and build those resources, but it's a sort of model that compounds value, as opposed to accelerators or VC funds that are kind of like starting anew more or less with every new cohort. And of course, there is some learning in VC funds and accelerators, and you can cross-pollinate, but because you don't necessarily have the specialization, coming back to the niche focus that I was talking about, nor the proximity, like you need to actually go down to the trenches to get more data, to get more learnings about what's working and what's not working. And that's how venture studios tend to outperform these other forms of collaboration. So recapping a little bit what I'm saying of the ingredients, then to have an effective swarm, we're talking about the niche focus, the venture studio model, and as well, we're talking about the interdependence of teams. So creating incentives, so it's not all dependent on the venture studio team. Let's say in our case in DAO, we call it the venture support team, like that team, that central team that's working with the ventures, but we can also leverage collaboration between the teams, like peer-to-peer collaboration. So what we do is that we have a specific financial, economic, contractual, legal design so that the startups that mature, they become co-owners of the umbrella. So all our successful startups, they become co-owners of DAO itself. And by being co-owners of DAO, while DAO has some ownership in each of these startups, then that means that by proxy, every startup is an owner of each other. So they benefit financially, as well as through the network effects of talent, brand recognition, customer access networks, et cetera, that every other startup can have. And so we have things like sharing user research and market insights, introducing each other to customers, leveraging similar ontologies, microservice and infrastructure. This is basically having similar compatible tech that they can integrate with each other, as well as talent networks and best practices. And this is something that for us, a year ago, roughly in DAO was a theory, but today we have now finally reached enough scale with 10 ventures in portfolio that we see this happening every week, that there is some forms of collaboration in between the different ventures that just organically start to emerge, or sometimes simply with a small nudge from our side of saying, hey, you developer from company A, have you spoken with developer from company B? Because they already solved this problem 2 weeks ago. And then developer from company B is more than happy to help because they are part of this curated community that has a collaborative culture, that has economic incentives for collaboration, as well as the systems and processes to make that possible. And of course, it's a work in progress, but as the swarm matures, all of these increases intensifies, and is the sort of compounding that we're talking about that can go even further than a traditional venture studio model, thanks to the interdependence between projects. So the different components kind of start to stack on top of each other to accelerate collaboration. Then the next component is that because we're working with very early stage organizations, like very early stage startups, we don't really know what's the ideal business path or development path for them. So some of these might end up going into an equity value maximization, like they're going to raise VC funding, they're going to do more rounds, they're going to maybe build a SaaS type of project, and that makes sense for that particular opportunity. In other cases, it makes more sense to launch a token and have some sort of protocol with a utility token. In other cases, you're going to generate more revenue, and you can actually generate revenue early and start to bootstrap the business through its own revenue generation. So part of the issue that traditional VC has is that they're relying only on the equity value maximization, or to a smaller degree on some token launching, to make the economics of the VC fund viable, to make it possible to actually deploy capital in these risky early stage ventures. But there is not enough flexibility that when you find some one of these startups that would actually be more oriented towards generating revenue, like contractually, the fund design is not enabling that. So we have had to do quite a bit of innovation in the legal aspect of things, in the contractual relationship with these startups, so that we can offer them flexibility to take whichever path makes sense for that business and still have alignment. So we're ensuring that the work and the capital, the resources, everything that the startup is investing into these startups is still regenerative, meaning there is going to be some sort of feedback loop where resources come back to the studio, and then we can keep on building more startups and create a flywheel, as opposed to the venture studio or like the swarm depleting itself, which is unfortunately what we saw when there were no proper mechanisms to regenerate the resources of the swarm. We saw, for example, with Bankless DAO, that the token price just kind of went down, 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 and there was not enough rigor in managing the token as a scarce asset. There was not enough rigor in having an innovation process that validated these startups, and the ecosystem started to lose a lot of value. And well, then finally there was some drama, and that was kind of like the final coup that more or less took down what otherwise was one of the most buoyant and exciting DAOs in the space at the time. So then finally, coming down to this idea of resources, one of the main challenges that venture studios have is that they are capital intensive. So if you want to do more for their startups than an accelerator, if you want to give them a lot more support than a venture fund does, if you actually want to be there down in the trenches, that has a significant cost. And building all of these startups has a lot of cost. Like, a lot of people need to work and put in really massive amounts of work to figure it out. So the usual way that we have to get these work is you have one or two, maybe three founders who work primarily for equity, and they sacrifice their savings, or they work for very tiny salaries for a very long time, and then they get the majority of the equity. Or otherwise, you raise capital from investors. So you give some money to some equity to investors, and in exchange of that, the investors can give you capital, and you can use that capital to hire people to work in the startup. But it seems to me that it can be somewhat inefficient in some cases, where you first have to go and convince startups to then go and convince talent to work for you, when instead what you can do is simply go and convince talent to work on this idea. And the more people work on the idea, the more they contribute, the more they own of the idea, the more they own of the startup, or otherwise of the whole swarm, if they're contributing more from the venture support team, or let's say at the swarm level. So what we have done is as well to advance a series of mechanisms so that we can enable people to contribute, that the more they contribute, the more they own. And so we're leveraging this whole network of contributors to invest into the swarm. And if we can then multiply this pattern at scale in the economy, what we're doing is that then a lot of good ideas are not dependent on the goodwill of investors, but they're simply dependent on communities being able to rally around those ideas and make them work. So the sweat equity as well, like the legal, contractual design, the mechanisms to calculate it and allocate it, has been another of the really critical components to allow us to essentially gain a little bit of scale velocity with what otherwise is a very forward-thinking idea that it would have been very hard to explain, because VCs know how to invest in startups, private equity knows how to invest in mature businesses, but who knows how to invest in swarms? Well, no one. Is a relatively new idea. There is a couple of examples out there like Hire and Constellation Software, etc., that have taken models in this direction. But in many ways, we're breaking new ice. So we needed to have a model for capital formation, essentially to attract enough resources to go and prove the idea before going out and convincing more institutional or traditional investors that this indeed made sense. So having the sweat equity has enabled us to simply gather a crowd of true believers and demonstrate that we can gain traction by working together. So now combined, what this is enabling is that we can actually have a very significant cultural and even economic shift in the way we think about innovation, entrepreneurship, and in general business. That we have a Web2 logic of having if you have an idea, you start a new venture from scratch. While if we can multiply the number of swarms and multiply the number of these collaborative ecosystems, what you can do is that you can go and build on top of these ecosystems, either by contributing and then becoming an owner or co-owner of the idea, by integrating some of the products, services, etc., that are already present there, or otherwise contributing capital, or leveraging the resources of the swarm in different ways. So we're not relying on every startup, a little bit like a cottage industry, to do things on their own, but we're leveraging the power of the ecosystem to incubate the whole thing. And so far it's still early days to some degree. We're in year 3. Is of course taking a while to figure out all of these components, and that takes time and energy, but we have that. Every year, we have more and more ventures that are interested in being part of the swarm. We have more and more members who are being part of the swarm, and we're starting to accelerate network effects where there is more and more value in being part of the ecosystem. So that attracts better talent, that attracts other ventures to join, and so on. And that's the flywheel that now we leverage as well, partnering with larger Web3 ecosystems to say, hey, instead of deploying capital through a grants program, or instead of deploying capital through a VC fund, why don't you deploy capital through a swarm? And then we can collaborate to develop a portfolio of collaborative startups instead of the traditional models that are a little bit more prone to failure. So anyway, let me leave it here. I saw a few questions in the chat. So if you'd like maybe to unmute, and I'll do my best to answer.
Yeah, I guess the questions are just me. Well, I was just going and asking more like the rest of the participants some questions. But with the end of this last segue, I was wondering, when you mentioned like joining the swarm, did you mean Erenda in that case, or you mean the swarm as the like all the projects together, not like belonging to any kind of group?
So DAO is a swarm. As I'm saying, there is a few other swarms out there, not many, but there is Hire, like Chinese IoT manufacturer, that also operates in a somewhat similar way. Of course, there is a few differences, but pattern-wise, it's very similar, and there is a few others out there in the wild. As a swarm, you can join one of the small teams that is providing services to the swarm. Like in the case of DAO, we have a research agency, we have a marketing team, we have a venture support team, and then a few other small activities here and there that happen outside those teams, like some business development, etc. And then we have all the startups that are associated with DAO. So you can either join one of the startups, you can join multiple, you can contribute in one of the teams that are like directly providing services to DAO.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, the main question was like, how do you like see yourself as a network? Because I don't know, I guess you know for sure that I'm running this swarm, and now we've been doing that for several years. And this, what I see, that the bigger you get, you start to see like this kind of like teams around different networks.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, just because you also mentioned you're like, are these groups that you are that come, are others coming from like external sources? Because there are bigger differences here. I can see that DAO has like more capital behind it, where in our network, the capital always has been like a struggle. So there is like a lot of sweat equity in first place, where you probably have now more the funds to grant other projects in the network to see where they can lead to. And just wondering, are these groups that you mentioned, like marketing, research, are they coming from internal or external when as you scale, and maybe even try to like how it was before and how is it now, maybe 2 years later? Does this kind of shift in the way, like as the network grows?
So, I mean, at the beginning, it was like 3, 4, 5 of us just hanging out. and doing meetings once a week, and there wasn't much else, right? Like it starts incredibly informal, and then from there it starts to formalize more and more. So we kind of had a small core team at the beginning that was advancing the idea and the vision and the research, etc. Then we started working on a first startup that was associated with DAO, but it was its own legally independent structure. And that's a startup that was completely bootstrapped. Like DAO didn't have any resources to invest into it other than providing some support, mentorship, like essentially helping advance the startup. That it was just some guys helping the startup do better. Then from there, there was a friend of mine who had a startup, and he was a little bit lost for product market fit. And we had some research on, essentially, we're thinking about starting a competing company that was Midwith. So he had Midwith Wallet, that was a scheduling tool, and we had some ideas of some market gaps around scheduling. And so we started chatting, and he was like, yeah, okay, you know what, I'm going to join. And that's kind of like the moment that we were perhaps a swarm for the first moment. Is we had two startups. DAO owned a percentage of those startups, but otherwise each startup was an independent entity. And so they all joined simply for the value that collaborating could bring to them, but also because they believe in the bigger vision, that it was not simply a transactional thing of how much value you can give me now, but understanding that the collaboration between the network of startups was going to bring them a lot more value than them building a product in isolation. So in very good part has been the appeal of the vision and being able to sell that vision to founders, to contributors, and say, hey, we're going to build this big network of startups that's going to be more than the sum of the parts. So then as we have matured, sometimes we have partnered with Web3 ecosystems to do ecosystem development programs. Like essentially we say, hey, we want to run a research fellowship for Arbitrum, give us some money. And so we went and got 6 entrepreneurs funded for 3 months to do some research and build startups. And then we got some grants for them and all of that. But it was mostly us operating as a kind of pirate ship, where we're like, come here and together we're going to go and hunt for treasure in the bigger world, but don't come to our DAO asking for money because we don't have any. We have like very purposely kept it very lean, which is the opposite pattern of what we have with some big Web3 ecosystems, where people come to ask for money from the central treasury, and then it all becomes politics of how do you get money from the DAO, as opposed to how do you deliver value to the market, and hence you can generate some revenue from the market together. So what we have specialized in is more in developing methodologies and ways to support these startups to do that better, to get money from the outside, rather than get money from the inside. From the inside, what they get is collaboration, mentorship, expertise, processes, systems, some support with marketing and distribution and things like that. And mostly a shared dream of building this big thing together, this big swarm together. And so we have some startups that join us from the outside because they see value in that. But increasingly, we're moving more towards the venture studio model, where we originate our own startups thanks to all the aggregate data and learnings that we have from essentially all of these ventures, all of these people doing research and trying to sell things and trying to spot entrepreneurial opportunities. We start to see some really interesting gaps, and we're like, you know what, let us launch this one from within. So we do the research, we kind of figure out what the problem is, and then we try to find founders who want to work with us and sort of take ownership of the startup. So the swarm continues owning a percentage of it, but then the majority of the ownership ideally is owned by the entrepreneurial team that goes and develops the venture beyond what us as a central team would be able to.
It's interesting. Like, I see one heavy difference with the swarm network that we're building here and yours, the tokenomics elements. We have tokenomics designs, how to recognize contributions of different things, but we never tied it together to a central swarm source, or like each team can have its own tokenomics, and we're just providing the like infrastructure. However, what I hear from you is like, are all the teams going to be part of some same equity, or like, and that is basically representing their time or their value into the network? Or
So,
how is
I mean, that's the critical thing, is that you don't have nor one extreme nor the other, but you have a combination of the two. So you have the legal entity, the ownership, the value accrual of each of the startups, and then you have the value accrual in the umbrella. And at the end, every startup, let's say every startup owns maybe 70 to 90% of the startup is owned by the contributors to that startup and the investors in that startup. And then the umbrella owns about 10 to 30, maybe 40% of that startup. But the startup itself also has some ownership in the umbrella. So it's this dual relationship that allows you to, on one side, have one common layer where everyone benefits, but also have the freedom so that the independent teams can succeed or fail by their own merits. Because if you don't have that, like if it's all collectivist, like we have in some DAOs, is that they try to build all the startups wrapped within the same monolithic big structure, is that then you're always fighting for who gets more resources. You don't have the freedom to experiment and move fast as an independent team. So here what we do is more like each team has a lot of freedom. They can succeed or fail, and the people contributing to that team will win more or less based on how much they succeed or fail. But then you also add a little bit of a collectivist element that if this startup is succeeding, it becomes part of this elite club that they're sharing some rewards, not all of the rewards, but also not zero.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I thought that was really awesome. I did have a question about kind of the setup that you have in terms of the swarms. When you have all these kind of independent entities, you know, one of the challenges that I've noticed is how to bring these individuals into collaboration with each other, whether it's, you know, developers, marketers, whatever kind of a niche vertical they are within the operations of that organization. Do you guys have some type of, you know, set up for some type of shared infrastructure that allows them or brings them back to the point of collaboration, or are there any mechanisms that you utilize to kind of encourage that type of behavior?
Yeah, so the most basic mechanism, and it doesn't scale very well, but it's the most effective, is we have our centralized venture support team that is working across the startups, and so has a lot of context of the challenges and capabilities of each team, and can just say, hey, go talk with those guys, and just be very, very effective. So that's kind of like a community manager sort of approach, that we can kind of like shift knowledge and orchestrate knowledge across. Now, that doesn't scale super well. So now that we're reaching bigger scale, we're leveraging a mechanism that Hire uses. Like Hire is a swarm with like 4,000 startups. So massive, is that they create communities focused on a specific customer segments. And then there is the Spotify approach that is creating communities of practice. So we have in Web3, that would be what sometimes is referred as a guild. So we have a growth guild, we have a fundraising guild, we have a developers guild, and these are relatively new. They're not yet super successful. Perhaps our growth guild is the one that has the most traction, and that's been in very good part through even me directly kind of like feeding it and directing people to it. But as it gains some critical mass, it starts to take off by itself, where now I realize there is people from some of the other startups that I never tagged in a post there. I didn't tell them, hey, go there. They just kind of found it organically and started applying some of the practices that someone else had shared in that guild of like, hey, I'm trying these. Have you guys gotten any success with it? Then I realized another startup already adopted the practice. So they become kind of like these mechanisms for knowledge sharing, but it does require a certain critical mass to animate them. And make them useful. So it's also like, let's say, the advantage of having these in-house as opposed to just an external community of marketeers is that there is the incentive alignment. So that really increases collaboration, and also there is the niche focus. So everyone here is doing collaboration tech ventures. It's very different if you were trying to market a game or trying to market a DeFi project or trying to market, I don't know, what health or transportation, mobility, whatever it is, right? Like, so because we have that niche, that also create more surface for collaboration. But is very, very significant work to get these mechanisms going. We're also developing Together Crew. We have a tool that can gather data from all the community and then do Q&A. So it's still relatively early stage technology, like there's still a good amount of knowledge to improve. But we are hoping that can evolve through having AI agents that are just learning from across the swarm and then can just by themselves, whenever they see you're making a comment or a question about the topic, they automatically respond. Like we already have, let's say, an MVP of these, but the room for improvement is massive.
Yeah, and do you envision that the kind of the specialization turning into some type of like kind of these sub DAO service DAOs where you have these kind of specialists within different areas of development, marketing, and things like that, kind of working with each other side by side and offering these different services internally to these different entities as you grow? Is that something that would be?
So there is a possibility of doing that. Like we have the first example that we have of this in R&DAO is our research agency. So recently we end up essentially just putting in some of the money that we had through doing different collaborations with ecosystems. We had maybe $10,000 spare. And I met this guy who's a really fantastic user researcher, like loads of experience, super senior, and he was interested in building a research agency. We said, hey, we'll hire you for 2 months and let's go and do some business development together. We started selling some research projects to external parties. Through that, now we have also, well, Mercedes, who's in the call, she's now working in that team as well, together with Daniel S., who's the lead of that team. And now we are about to hire 2 more people into that team. So it's kind of like generating its own revenue as a research agency and just growing. But then what we're doing is that R&DAO is giving some tokens, R&DAO tokens, like essentially some ownership to the contributors of that team. And in exchange of that, well, thanks to that, we can lower the amount of fiat that every contributor needs per month. So that increases the runway of the team. And with that extra runway, we use those, that we gave on R&DAO tokens, we use it as a research budget that the central team can hire the agency to do research for us. So we can probably, like, we can probably scale this up to have a full product agency where we can have some design, development, etc., to do more things. And that's how we advance further towards this venture studio model, where there is more and more things that the central team is doing hands-on, as opposed to relying to the startups just doing it by themselves and doing incubation. But it's a relationship with many forces and multiple configurations. Ultimately, we want to leave it a little bit to the dynamics of the internal market and the entrepreneurial pursuits of the people involved to drive those things as they see, well, the forces of supply and demand kind of coming into effect. Because that becomes a better coordination mechanism than us trying to mandate too much top-down. It is a balance. Like there is some part of top-down is strategically prioritizing things and encouraging people who come in, sometimes discouraging or being like, I don't think that's a good idea right now, or yeah, that's a great thing, go for it. So you kind of pull multiple levers and engages, and there is a balance of making sure that the startups can still develop enough internal capabilities to do some of these things eventually. So there, depending on the industry, venture studios can have very different models. Like if you're in pharma, it's very capital intensive. You're going to put in, as a venture studio, you're going to put a lot of work, even many years before you can spin off the company as an independent entity. If you're doing consumer products, it can be a little bit the opposite. You almost want to spin it out, launch a token and see, or just launch it out there and see if it resonates or not really quickly. B2B is a little bit more in the middle. And so there is kind of like this fine balance in between every team of how much do you want to bring in sort of internal agency service versus just people leading that team. And that depends a lot on what the swarm is about. what sort of talent you're attracting, and so on. So it's kind of like a big pattern and nebulous, but generally speaking, yeah, we're super interested to develop more of these sort of internal agency or mixed agency sub-DAO sort of type of capabilities. Please, Stefan.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Daniel. I'm Stephen here. I'm over in Toronto. Nice to connect in. I was just saying, I'm interested in, you mentioned about these different, you go from the niche. So I do a lot of work with community-based organizations and like local groups. And you talk about niche focus. So, and then you go to the venture studio. So is it kind of getting more ontological as you go there? Like it gets more codified in terms of the structuring of knowledge in going from niche to venture? Because you talked about at some point you'll be able to share ontologies. Is that in a venture studio scale?
Well, there are multiple things here, and like there are so many components to the whole thing that you could say share ontologies at multiple levels. It would be relatively true. Some of the very practical ways in which we're approaching these is we're now starting to do a lot of research on identity and account management and login. And we're looking to develop an internal protocol so that you can have a sort of single sign-on for all of the ventures in the portfolio. So that when users are creating an account in any of the R&DAO ventures, they are not having to create a new account every time and connect their Twitter and Discord or email every time, but they do it once and then it works across the portfolio, and even potentially with ventures outside of R&DAO. And it becomes kind of like a venture on its own rights. Same thing with having social graphs, or anyway, different ways, right? So these are some of the, let's say, tech infrastructure ontology of how do you define accounts, identities, things like that. There is also another layer to these around market segments. And a lot of the research that we do as a central team is sort of understanding what are the different problem spaces where you could have a product. So we know, okay, accounting, we probably need 1 or 2 products related to accounting. We don't really know what product, but there is something there. And that's going to be a little bit different from the tool that does contributor payments, rewards, and compensation. And that's going to be different from the tool that allows these projects to do crowdfunding or fundraising on chain, etc. And so we kind of start to map an ontology of market opportunities, which also helps us to orient the startups to figure out where they can collaborate and where not. Because otherwise, as a startup, like you get a little bit too lost in the, you miss the forest for the trees. You're so focused on the details that anyone else doing anything remotely adjacent to you can feel like a competitor. So we also help them to untangle these opportunities of where there is really overlap and where there is not. And we're kind of doing a little bit of a therapist job often of soothing those scarcity competition fears. And being like, no, look, actually what they're doing is very different. It will play very differently because of X, Y, Z, which is more kind of like that macro view that the venture support team is better positioned to have rather than the individual entrepreneurs.
So you could get into something, there's something called systemic coaching, or matrix coaching could be kind of linked to that in a way. So that's okay. And have you ever thought of, so you've got like social network analysis type of tools, right, that can then process, but there's also participatory influence mapping. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's kind of like a process of, that was being done out in Africa for villages, where you do it by hand. And then that might be kind of interesting. But I'd love to, I'm sure we'll talk more, but that's interesting. Thank you for your feedback.
No, thank you. Thank you for the question. And yeah, kind of curious to hear more about these approaches. What I would say is it's really dependent on the scale to be able to afford to do it and to derive enough value for it. So we're now just starting to get to the point that we really operate as a swarm and not just 2 free startups. But even there are multiple things that we're like, like the social network mapping, etc. We're like, this will probably derive a lot of value when we're 3 times the size. And right now it does a little bit, but not that much.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think also I'm interested with AI is AI, often people think about feeding in big data, but we already could do that with algorithms. But what's interesting is processing a lot of this hyper-local contextual stuff used to be too onerous, whereas AI, it doesn't necessarily need to do any thinking for it, but you could just do ordering the material in the ethnography. So there could be some benefits there. So that's cool. So yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. I think there was Matt who had a question, but I saw him leave, or...
Super interesting, Daniel. Thank you for this. Like you've talked about the value of sharing business capabilities among the startups in the swarm. Is there, and that role being mediated by some specialized teams or the fractional founder kind of role, is there a pathway to systemizing that? I don't know, maybe some kind of like GitHub repository for shared business capabilities, and you know, maybe even some sort of self-discovery. Like, I guess I'm thinking of teams, some kind of API of services that they can offer or consume.
Yeah, I think what you're suggesting is interesting. We currently do not have any good mapping of it. I would say in many ways that's something that up until now it would have been a waste of time because it was just too small and too emergent. But now it starts to become an interesting question of something that we'll probably have to be thinking about over the next 1-2 years to enable the whole thing to scale. It's like, how can we create these team APIs so they can collaborate better? And we have interesting emerging things in this regard, where like there is work groups that form around MCP servers, so like the whole interoperability between agents kind of created a cluster, and then there was like something around decision making and sense making, and so we have 3 startups that are collaborating closely on a business proposal. And from the other side, another collaboration of like, yeah, can we integrate our agents and do things? But it works because we're small. If we were big, you would very much get lost and not have any idea what are the resources that the network has, other than depending on the fractional co-founders, which, as I'm saying, is not the most scalable thing. So it's, yeah, let's say it's a very interesting problem to think about, but only starting to become relevant now.
Having some experience also with like aggregating information and trying to build some kind of dashboards that have all holistic views. And I agree with Daniel, like most of the time, the operation of gathering that information, that the insight you're looking for, is faster than building entire infrastructure. However, what I do see is that over time, every few quarters, you kind of look at the portfolio of what has been done, and you see like these modular pieces. Oh, somebody created a calendar here, and it's open source, and we can use API. Oh, somebody has created a skill list tree that has social media of these accounts and these skills. There is somebody who has created list of things he's interested to learn. And over time, you cannot just like, oh, we can connect these and do like A2N or like use some MVP solutions to quickly generate the graph of and collecting the information when it's relevant. So I think as time goes by and people kind of try to self-reflect what they have, they will start to realize more and more of the sources they have, and eventually they're like, hey, this is the cool like suite we need, all of this information in this format. And then, like, well, as you already, this kind of swarm is pulling up, it's like these emergent teams. Oh, we can take this up. Hey, let's put now a team together to create this dashboard, and especially if you're in a good position that you have your own treasury, you can play around with these kinds of like internal tooling, where oftentimes if you're only like expecting or like looking for funds, then you don't have like this time to make your own yourself like a more improvement or better, and you only focus on how to help the customer so that we can build our reputation so we can get the next customer. So there is always this kind of dynamic that tries.
Yeah, absolutely. That resonates. That's kind of like the things that maybe in the last 6 months we're seeing as emerging behaviors, and then in the next year, 2 years, it could be start to become consolidated. And like I really like the metaphor of how the Japanese build gardens, that like they kind of open the park to people, let them walk, and then they see, well, the grass is wilted, and put a road. So I guess that's more or less the approach we're taking. That's not to say that it's going to happen by itself, like probably will require a lot of work. And it's not something we have been able to prioritize so far. Let's say we're still putting the most of our focus of, can we get a success story out of one of our ventures? Like just get one that becomes, people go like, oh, you are the guys behind this venture that everyone knows. Of course I'm going to join, kind of thing. We're not there yet. Like our startups are still young and have to prove themselves. So for now, that's really our core focus, is getting one first or two first success stories. And then that becomes the foundation to continue building on top.
At this stage where lots of the ideas kind of sound like over-engineering and things are a little bit messy and socially and culturally mediated, is there a role for AI agents to do some of that mediation, because they're quite good at dealing with messy, unstructured stuff?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there is. It's I mean, if you guys want to jump in and try to figure it out, we have some of the data infrastructure already built, and is there for people to join and collaborate. That's how the Swarm works, really. Personally, I'm pretty maxed out, so there is very little I can take on of these cool ideas. I'm like, oh, that's awesome, but no chance I can do anything about it myself. So you guys are very welcome to come and help us out. Stefan?
Yeah, I think that's it. I suppose one thing that's the challenge, I think, with the AI, and it's good, is how can the AI help to pull together information but not do the thinking? Because all the AI will do is think in terms of what data it's already seen. And so there's a question about it can pull together stuff like ontologies can be useful. And then then the thing is how to feed it back into human sense finding or sense making. And that would be the interesting piece, I think. So that, because otherwise you can end up with an interpretation which is essentially whatever the old literature said. But there will be a sense of so there's a process methodological piece going on here, which I think is quite interesting. So I think good point, Dan.
Yeah, good point. All right, guys. Well, I'm gonna have to jump, carry on grinding. But thank you very much for listening and all the questions and participation. Really appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, you know where to find me. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I really do appreciate you taking the time out to teach us a little bit about DAO Swarms. And if you guys want to catch up or learn any more, please do check out RnDAO and Daniel. I assume it's okay to DM you individually. But yeah, thank you for joining us today. And Token Engineering Commons is going to be hosting a lot more of these research events. And if you guys are interested, please do stay tuned and check out some of the different areas of research that we have going on in Web3 and sharing that with the ecosystem. So thank you once again, Daniel. It means a lot. Really appreciate the hard work you've been doing. And yeah, look forward to collaborating more in the future.
Thank you, guys. Have a great rest of the day.
Stay curious. Bye, y'all.